to start with a presentation by Claude Miller and Haijing Ma and Yifeng Wang and Doris Acheme. And Claude is the professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Communication at the University of California. He's published in the areas of persuasion, social influence, emotion, motivation, disaster preparedness, and health communication. So I'm going to stop sharing here and let Claude take over, please.
Okay. So can everybody hear me and see the screen? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just pop this into presentation mode if it works. This is the first time I've used Prezi, so it's, let me see here.
Good luck.
Yeah. I kind of like it because, as you can see, you've got these coronavirus topics sort of floating around in the air. And if you imagine the crowns, coming off of them, it adds a little drama to the presentation. I'm willing to bet that probably everybody out there, the 40 or 50 people watching right now, not too many of you are enthusiastic about wearing masks, even though roughly 85% say that you do it. Probably nobody looks forward to it. The prospect is unpleasant. I myself don't like to do it because it's harder to breathe. But yet we know very well that the evidence indicates that wearing masks controls the spread. And if you look at places like South Korea or Taiwan or New Zealand, where mask wearing is a cultural thing, they haven't lost very many people to the pandemic compared to other places like here in the US. And just generally speaking, about 60% of the people report that they consistently wear masks. Now, this was actually taken in July. We did two studies. I'm going to give you study one, where we collected data on sort of the downslope of wave one of the pandemic. And at that time, about 60% of the people, give or take 20%. And if you can see over here on the right, this map, this is by county, and the darker red indicates higher probability that 5 out of 5 people that you meet in public would be wearing a mask. And you can see that the West Coast and the East Coast, particularly New York area, a lot of mask wearing. And through the heartland, not that much. And you can kind of also sort of overlay red states and blue states, and it also sort of predicts mask wearing. So it seems obvious that it's both a political and a symbolic sort of topic and behavior. And there's lots of moral differences involved in whether we use masks or not. Let me see if I can. Okay. So,
Claude,
yes.
Can you make your presentation full screen and also not presentation mode?
Oh, okay. I think I can. What was happening there?
Well, we see your regular slide, we see your points, and then we see the actual sequence of images at the bottom.
Oh, okay. Well,
if you can't do it, that's fine.
How about this? Can you see everything there?
Does not change anything. At the bottom, I'm thinking that maybe it's not worth it. I don't want to use up your time trying to solve this problem.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I mean, can you see the main screen and
well, you certainly want to get rid of the Arthur and Rupe Annual Conference webpage.
Oh, I wonder if that's. Oh, you're on the wrong. I see what's happening. How about this?
Yeah. There you go. Yay.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Had you on the wrong screen. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
So, okay.
One technology zero.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, for a lot of people, wearing a mask is symbolic. It's a political statement, and we might even say that that's more true for people on the right than on the left. And so, ideologically speaking, there is sort of this left-right divide, and people on the left tend to be the ones who are wearing masks, whereas people on the right tend to be the ones, the more conservatives tend to be the ones who object to wearing masks. And for a lot of people, particularly on the right, masks are thought of in terms of their ideological interests. So whether they wear one or don't wear one is a matter of ideology for them. And so we look at this in terms of a moral question. You know, why do people choose to wear a mask or not wear a mask? And you know, a quick working definition of morality is, you know, it deals with how people relate to each other to promote what they feel is right or good. And for this, we use Haidt and Macaulay's theory to answer this question. And so, and the question being, you know, what are the moral foundations underlying decisions to wear or not wear masks in response to the pandemic? And moral foundation theory, which was developed about 15 years ago by Haidt and Macaulay and colleagues, they have sort of identified 5 different foundations. And you could think of these different moral foundations sort of like sort of like your sense of taste. Like you have different taste receptors. So your tongue can taste, one receptor would be maybe for salt, another one for sugar or for sweetness, maybe a third one for sour, fourth one for savory. And in the same sense, you sort of have moral foundation. Each one of your moral foundations is like a moral taste receptor. You think of it that way. And 2 of the 5 foundations are characterized as individualizing foundations, and they have to do with care versus harm and fairness versus cheating. And Haidt and colleagues have sort of have identified these as the 2 main moral foundations that people on the left, that liberals tend to use in their moral decisions. They tend to be individual, you know, related. So what causes harm to an individual, or how can we promote care? Same thing with fairness or cheating. How do we avoid cheating? The other 3 foundations are referred to as binding foundations because they're more about forming in-group loyalties and coalitions, and so what bind people together rather than make them individuals. And here you have sort of 3 taste receptors, moral taste receptors, if you will. In-group betrayal, so it's sort of opposite, you know, ends of the spectrum. In-group loyalty as opposed to betrayal, authority as opposed to subversion, and submission to authority would also, you know, include traditions and social normative values. And then a third binding foundation is sort of on the spectrum of purity to degradation, or you might say what's natural compared to what's unnatural, or what's sanctified compared to degrading. So these are the 5 moral foundations, and you can think of them more as intuitive. They're intuitions rather than reason-based sort of decisions. So even when logic breaks down, we tend to still stick with our guns. We tend to still feel, we have a gut feeling about what's right or wrong, regardless of the reasons one way or the other. If we look at reasons for wearing masks or for not wearing masks, there's quite a few of those. And we looked at news reports, media reports, we looked at just word of mouth, friends, what they were saying, and also social media. And we came up with 59 different items that were common or typical reasons either to wear masks or to not wear masks. And among the reasons to wear masks, you know, 25 of our different reasons fell under 5 different factors. And so a typical reason would be, you know, it's clearly useful and effective. It protects myself from the virus, protects other people from the virus. According to law, I have to do it. And you can see how, you know, these fall into different sort of categories or different factors. When it comes to not wearing masks, 34 out of the 59. So there people tend to have more reasons not to wear masks than to wear masks. And so, some sample items would be, it's clearly not useful. It's uncomfortable. I don't know anybody that has COVID. It doesn't make me look good. I can't breathe very well. So there's plenty of reasons not to. And we found 8 factors. These 34 different reasons sort of clustered into 8 factors. And I'll talk a little bit more about those as we go on. So those are the reasons. And here are our hypotheses. So we're going to apply moral foundation theory. And the first hypothesis has to do with liberals. And liberals are inclined to wear masks. I think most of us would agree. And you could see that the big difference in between California, when Nora was talking earlier, and Oklahoma, Californians are much more likely to wear masks and to social distance than the more conservative people here in Oklahoma. And so we predicted that individualizing foundations, the two, harm and fairness, should predict people's reasons for wearing masks, or I should say liberals' reasons for wearing masks. Our second hypothesis concerns conservatives, and conservatives tend to lean towards not wearing masks. And so according to moral foundation theory, we would expect that the binding foundations would predict conservatives' reasons for not wearing masks. We have a third hypothesis, which is, again, looking at liberals. And now how do liberals feel about not wearing masks? And so we predict that their individualizing foundation should be negatively associated with the different reasons to not wear masks. We also have a research question about conservatives. We weren't ready to hypothesize about how conservatives what would make them feel good about wearing masks. And we know from Haidt Macaulay and from moral foundation theory that although liberals tend to use the two individualizing foundations, conservatives tend to use all 5, although they lean much more towards the binding foundations than the individualizing foundations. So we're asking the question, which of the 5 moral taste receptors are likely to be associated with the reasons why conservatives would want to wear masks. And so here's our method. We had 324 MTurk workers, and we sampled them from across the country because we wanted to get people living in red states as well as blue states, and we have some sort of swing states in here as well. So we wanted to get a good cross section of the country and quote unquote real people rather than students. Not that students aren't real people and very valuable. So we ran 13 backward stepwise regressions. So really one regression for each one of the clusters of reasons to or not to wear masks. And we entered all 5 moral foundations together into the first block as predictors. And we used self-reported politics or a political party as a proxy for whether someone was liberal or conservative. So if you called yourself a Democrat, we think that means you're a liberal and a Republican conservative. We also measured independence and have some data from moderates, but we're not going to go into that in this presentation. I can address that in some questions afterward if anybody's interested. So within each one of these regressions, we entered one of the 13 subscales. So 5 of the reasons for wearing masks and 8 of the reasons for not wearing masks. And we looked at how the regression handled that. So let's take a look at our hypotheses here. The first one deals with liberals wearing masks, and it was supported. So both the harm and fairness taste receptors, if you will, were positive predictors of 4 out of the 5 mask wearing reasons to wear masks for liberals. And so mask utility, if you see up the upper right here, threat reduction, these are practical reasons for wearing masks. Altruism, so I want to be polite, I want to protect other people. That's also predicted by both harm and fairness. It's a legal norm, legally I should do it and socially I should do it. These were predicted, well, legal was predicted by the harm individualizing foundation, but also the in-group binding foundation, which we hadn't anticipated. And social norms, so in other words, I wear a mask because it's what's normal, it's what everybody's doing. That was more predicted by in-group, which is a binding foundation. And so we would not have anticipated that for liberals. For hypothesis 2, now we're predicting how conservatives would feel about not wearing masks. What sort of moral foundations drive that? And this is partially supported. 2 of the binding foundations, the purity and the in-group, explained 4 out of the 8 reasons for not wearing masks, the clusters of reasons. So it's uncomfortable, that was predicted by purity. It's not normal, purity. It's unattractive, I don't look good, again, purity. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to do, and that was predicted by in-group. So both of these are binding foundations, and they predict at least half of the reasons for not wearing. If we look at hypothesis 3 and research question 1, this is where I think it gets more interesting. So now we're looking at liberals, how liberals feel about not wearing masks. And we know there's a lot of controversy here on both sides but for the most part, we predicted that fairness and harm would be major sort of taste receptors, moral taste receptors, moral foundations, guiding people or associated with not wearing masks. And it's a negative predictor. The way you might look at this is my fairness receptor says this doesn't taste good. This doesn't look good. I don't like it. So if you give a reason, it's not required, that doesn't feel right. It's ineffective. Here's the 8 different clusters. It's uncomfortable. The government's wrong about that. And most people thought of the government as being the CDC. It's not necessary. It's not worthy. It's unattractive. And so liberals have sort of a negative response to that based on their fairness, a fundamental moral value. Now, if we look at the research question 1, this is dealing with conservatives' reasons for wearing masks. Okay, so conservatives normally generally being inclined to not wear a mask. Now we want to know what makes a conservative feel good about wearing a mask. And we weren't ready to predict whether it would be binding or individualizing moral foundations, because we know that conservatives use all 5. So we posed this as a research question. And we found out that wearing a mask was positively predicted by both the individualizing foundation of fairness and binding foundation of in-group. And so in terms of 4 out of the 8, so threat reduction, utility, altruism, it's the legal norm. And for social norm, it was only predicted by out-group. But for all the others, it was both fairness and in-group. And actually, for reasons to wear the masks, liberals and conservatives are not that far apart. They both have fairness and in-group involved, or moral foundations driving their behavior. I think probably what is the most, I knew I would do this. Go right here. Yeah. Okay. The most interesting finding that we had, in my opinion, is the answer to research question 1. And, involves, what are the reasons for conservatives to wear a mask? And not what the reasons are, but what's the underlying instinct that would make a conservative feel good about wearing a mask. And what we found was, fairness and in-group. Wait, here now. Oh, I should have. let me go to the conclusions here. Okay, so our main conclusion is moral foundation theory does a really good job of predicting the intuitive aspects, the intuitive, quote unquote reasons. And I put it in scare quotes because it's more of a gut feeling rather than, a cognitive sort of logic, reason-based determination of, it's more about what feels good or what tastes good when we're talking about moral foundations. And so moral foundation theory predicts that indeed liberals tend to be pro-mask because of their individualizing moral foundations, and conservatives tend to not want to wear masks because of the binding foundations. So this is, this is good support for moral foundation theory. I think it's also, probably the most important aspect of our research, the most important finding has to do with conservatives. What would make them feel good about wearing a mask? And that's really where the challenge is. And people are talking about, we need to address the proper audience and we need to think about strategic communication. And so from a message design point of view and also from sort of public policy point of view, the real challenge is not with liberals, getting liberals to wear masks or to do social distancing. The real challenge is to get conservatives to feel good about wearing a mask. And not just when it has to do with COVID-19, but if we have future, heaven forbid, pandemics coming down, how could we sort of influence the more difficult population? And so, and the answer here is wearing a mask. If you want to get conservatives to feel good about it, appeal to their sense of fairness, and also their sense of in-group loyalty. And so, in other words, the other three foundations, harm, whether it's we're talking about harm or care, or talking about purity or authority. Those don't press conservatives that much to wear masks, not as much as their sense of fairness and in-group. So maybe that's the takeaway here. This was study one. We collected this data in July, and sort of as I said, it's on the backswing of phase of the first wave in the pandemic. We also collected data after October 2nd. So if you recall, that's when Trump came down with coronavirus and went to the hospital, and he was seen wearing a mask. And so we went back out and collected more data at that point.
So Claude, we're gonna have to wrap it up here.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say that was messier. And so I can wrap it up now, and I can ask questions later, or answer any questions later that you might have. So I'll stop the share.
All right, great, thanks so much. I think what's fascinating about that is I've been interested in the moral values thing. I haven't done any research on it myself. I know Renee in his lab has done a lot of it. We're going to hear about that in a little bit. But it really is a nice way of revealing a lot of the complex and subtle and not necessarily mutually exclusive reasons for why people do things, and often not consciously and maybe not even intentionally. So I think it's I've been thinking about using that in terms of health campaigns too, and environmental campaigns, same issue. So a powerful tool, and also you had pretty satisfying results. I mean, not satisfying at the moral level, perhaps, but satisfying at the research level. So we thank you, and we'll probably have some questions about that. All right, I want to shift now to Haejung Kim. She's a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences here at UC Santa Barbara. She's primarily interested in cultural psychology, looking at how culture influences psychological processes to understand why and how people engage in a range of everyday behaviors, such as pro-environmental actions, social support use, and consumer decision-making. She has a slightly different title. It's called Stranger Together, Collectivism and the Response to Disease Threat. So, Professor Kim, please take it away.
Okay. How does it look?
Great.
Okay. So yes, last minute title change, Stronger Together, Collectivism and the Response to Disease Threats. I had a more descriptive title at the beginning, but I figured that, this gives a little more optimistic message. Anyway, thank you so much, Ron, for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to be part of it. Okay, and before I start my talk, I would like to, acknowledge my collaborators on these projects, and Professor David Sherman at UCSB, same department, and then is a collaborator on both projects I'm going to be talking about. And then Sui is a current grad PhD student who spearheaded the second part of the talk study that I'll be talking about, and these are other international collaborators. And right, with that. Okay, the threat of disease is a constant influence in our lives, in all living organisms, and obviously we are focusing on human, but it is something we always, sometimes it is just some simple case of flu, but other times it is something but much larger and much more scary. And if even within the last 20 years or so, we face a lot of threats. So this is picture from about 2003 with SARS in East Asia. This is 2014 Ebola in West Africa. And this is Zika where did it go? Zika in 2015 in Brazil. And of course, we have coronavirus that we are grappling with. And, this is basically the, virus that's threatening the entire Earth. So, given that the threat of disease has been present through the human evolutionary history, we know a fair bit about how people respond. It is a predictable response people are showing. And one of the probably the most relevant theory coming from psychology is the pathogen prevalence hypothesis. And basically what theory argues is that when people are facing potential threat of a contagious disease, people tend to exhibit xenophobia. And that is fear or hatred of strangers and foreigners. And it takes many different forms. But basically the idea is that when there's a threat of disease hovering in your environment, you want to close down so that the pathogen doesn't infiltrate your community. So try to keep the border closed and all that stuff. But it is also associated with a sort of an emotional reaction, such as fear and hatred of people who are not us, essentially. So when we are looking at how people are responding to the disease threat, especially looking at the xenophobic responses, there are, one thing people have found was that it's not that, if there's a threat of disease, everyone will respond in the same way, but rather there's some individual difference, and there's a psychological precursors of how people are responding to the threat in a xenophobic way. And one such precursor is perceived vulnerability. Just because there's an objective existence of threat out there doesn't necessarily mean all individuals feel equally vulnerable. Some people, for whatever reason, feel more vulnerable than others. And it turned out, not surprisingly, those people who feel more vulnerable tend to show stronger xenophobic response. Another factor is the psychologically perceived efficacy in protecting themselves. So meaning that, again, just like vulnerability, just because there's some sort of objective tool to deal and cope with threat doesn't necessarily mean that everyone feels the same level of efficacy. And those people who feel more efficacious in protecting themselves, they tend to respond in a less dramatic way, and they are a little more subdued and all that. So with these, one question we wanted my collaborators and I wanted to address is kind of identifying what are some other little more distal psychological factor that could possibly predict vulnerability too, but focusing on more of a perceived efficacy. And so what are some of the psychological factors that could predict perception of protection efficacy against the disease? What is something about the person who is able to feel like, I can cope with it, I can protect myself and my community? And we focus on the factor of collectivism. Okay, collectivism is a cultural value orientation, and it is essential. There's many different definitions you can find, but collectivism is really about to what extent people in a society or in a group or as an individual prioritize a group goal over an individual goal. How much, if there's a lot of times group interests and individual interests align. However, there are times when group needs individual to do something and individuals want something else. In some cultures and some people, they think that in that case, then the individual should sort of make a little bit of personal sacrifice for the common good. But other cultures and other people who tend to think that the group interest might have to be compromised a little bit in order to give freedom to individuals. So that's the dimension we are talking about. And then in more collectivistic society and also among more collectivistic people, they generally think that social relationships and group belongingness is much more important part of who they are. It's not that people who are not in collectivistic society don't care about relationship or belonging, but it is more about like it is a sense of who I am is, it is basically determined by, my belongingness to group and what kind of relationship I have. So that is sort of very brief overview of collectivism. So collectivism is relevant, we thought, in this line of question, because when we are talking about larger sort of level of the disease threat, pandemic and whatnot, this is inherently a situation where individuals alone cannot cope. It requires some sort of group level action. So we thought that the obvious question was that whether collectivism could provide some sort of psychological protection in situations requiring group level coping responses. So we ran a study, and this was a study that was published in 2016 in Psychological Science. So we investigated the role of collectivism in how people respond to fear of disease, especially looking at their xenophobic responses to that. And the data was collected during the height of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, to be precise, December 11th through 23rd was when the data was collected. And the research question we asked were first, would high vulnerability to Ebola be associated with a greater xenophobic threat responses? So it's essentially, we tried to replicate previous findings about how people respond to disease threat in terms of their xenophobic response. And then the second question, for us, more primary question, is whether collectivism could serve as a psychological buffer. And we looked at the collectivism in two different ways. One is looking at multi-level model, kind of looking at the regional level of shared collectivism, looking at all 50 US states. And also we measure individual level collectivism as a personal value dimension. I don't have time to talk about the the group level results, during the Q&A, if there's a time, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm going to focus on the individual level of value measure. Anyway, so there was a second question. And the third question is, if collectivism serves as a psychological buffer, then what is the psychological mechanism? We thought that, perhaps protection efficacy plays a role. And essentially, so we wanted to see whether collectivism enables greater protection efficacy to cope with disease, in this particular case is Ebola. And of course, our hypothesis was yes and yes and yes. So method, so we collected a nationally represented US sample using YouGov. So it was large sample of the 1,000 Americans. And the study was pretty straightforward. We included individualism, collectivism scale. And then we include some measures of perceived vulnerability to Ebola. So this is just a one sample item, but it's something like, I feel vulnerable to Ebola infection. And so that is fairly face value, straightforward question. But we asked this question 3 times And there's other several questions too, but each question was asked 3 times. One is in reference to oneself and my kind of local community, and then my country. And it turned out that they actually hang really highly together. So we end up just combining all as a measure of a perceived vulnerability. Second measure we include, or third measure we included, was the perceived protection efficacy. Very similar in structure. I, my community, or my country feel confident that I can protect myself from, or ourselves from Ebola. So that was, again, very face valid measures. And then the xenophobic response has multiple measures included. One is kind of more affective measure of prejudice against outgroup members. And outgroup members for 2 different groups were the reference groups. One was West African, because that was the target group that was specifically associated with the Ebola at the time. And then we wanted to see whether this xenophobic psychology sort of generalized spill over to other outgroup members beyond just the target that is a source of what people think is a source of threat. So we included a measure of a prejudice against the undocumented immigrants, just to see as an additional outgroup. And then, we included a measure of ethnocentrism, thinking that the US is better than all other places, sort of sentiment. And then the last one was kind of more of a support for outgroup restrictive policies. So, at that time, people were talking about travel ban and, whatnot. So, we measured to what extent people support those type of kind of keeping outside out sort of policy. And then demographic measures and all that is included. And then, so this is the first, the key result. So first question we addressed in this research was overall pattern, the relationship between perceived vulnerability to Ebola and people's xenophobic response. And as you can see in both groups, there's a pretty strong positive slope, meaning that as individuals feel more vulnerable to Ebola, they were more xenophobic. So we found that in all groups. However, we also found the support for second research question and hypothesis that collectivism would serve as a notable buffer against this, meaning that when you look at the top dark, the solid line, so that represent individuals who score low, relatively low on collectivism. And so that slope is pretty steep. However, if you look at the dotted line, this group, which are represent the responses from people who score high on collectivism, among people who are more collectivistic, essentially, yes, the vulnerability and xenophobia are positively correlated, to be sure. However, the slope is much more mild, meaning that these people are not as strongly reactive in terms of increasing their xenophobic tendency. So, what this, of course, it's a correlation analysis and all that, but we thought that this support our hypothesis that, perhaps the collectivism serves as some sort of psychological buffer. And then to see whether it is really buffering, we did a mediation analysis. Actually, in the paper, we have a very complicated SCM model, but this is a simplified version of the results. So basically what we have looked at is the role of psychological, so perceived protection efficacy in explaining the buffering of collectivism. And what we have found was that the collectivism by perceived vulnerability I just showed you, predicting xenophobia, was indeed significantly mediated by protection efficacy, meaning that when people are, when collectivistic individuals, even though they feel more vulnerable, if among the, I guess better way to put it is that among the people who are more, who feel highly vulnerable, if they're collectivistic, it seems like they feel a greater sense of protection efficacy. And that seemed to play a role in basically kind of subduing their, relatively extreme psychological response to the threat of disease. So that was our sort of first study in looking at collectivism in relation to disease threat.
So
But then, yeah.
I'm just going to mention here, I have to keep a little eye on time.
Okay, how much time do I have?
Thanks.
How much time do I have?
Um, maybe 4 minutes.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So try to move very quickly. So then next question we want to ask is that, yes, sounds nice that collectivism is buffering against extreme sort of threat response, but we don't really, it wasn't really clear why that happens and why then does collectivism increase protection efficacy. And unfortunately, for better or worse, COVID happened and gave us ample opportunity to test this idea. So one thing that's a little different about COVID from something like Ebola is that because it became such a real issue for Americans and other places, and it was with us for a very long time, we end up having a quite long series of behavioral, sort of suggestions and recommendations. So we all know this, we know all about social distancing, stay-at-home orders, and then, there was some, a lot of places actually use the digital contact tracing as a way to cope and then control this disease. And of course, everyone is encouraged to wear a mask, as Claude had also shown. So in this study, we decided to look at the digital contact tracing and face covering as our key sort of the behavioral outcome and see how that plays out with the collectivism. Okay, so these two things, among with other things, share commonality. One is both impose personal costs, as also Claude talked about. So, it's like something like in the case of DCT, it's a potential violation of privacy. There's a potential cost for individuals, but it could be useful in terms of protecting community sort of idea. There's a little bit of a, oppositional cost at play. And then, another important thing is in order for these things to be effective, it shouldn't be just some random smattering of individual doing it. There has to be critical mass of people following this guideline. So we thought that, collectivism is a relevant factor. Maybe collectivism could predict greater compliance and responsiveness to health messages. And as a matter of fact, the recent study actually published showing that the face covering compliance rates are much higher in collectivist countries, looking at the national level, the analysis. In our study, we are not just here to show that collectivism is protective or not, but rather we wanted to see what is it about collectivism that is bringing out this potential positive outcome. And so we went back to the basic notion of collectivism, and there are a number of aspects of collectivistic tendency that might explain the potential benefit of collectivism. First one is general pro-social concerns for sharedness, shared group. So pro-social concerns for communal versus personal protection kind of idea. Second one is sensitivity to social norms. It's all conformity, but also seeing group level cohesion is more common among high collectivistic individuals. And then another aspect of collectivism is that it is trust in institution, including government. Okay. So we collected data from 4 different countries, and our intention isn't to actually compare the group level differences, because the reason I'm sort of rushing it is the reason why the cross-cultural comparison in our study didn't really work out is that all the countries are going through the COVID cases and how they're coping with it in such a rapidly different and complicated way. So comparing American results when we collect the data at particular cross-sectional sense and with Germany or Japan or Singapore was kind of meaningless. But the purpose of our study is actually we were looking at the role of individual level collectivism and how that is predicting their behavior, and see whether that model holds consistently in 4 cultures. So that was the study. And we include these measures, you can kind of look at quickly. So essentially we include the individual collectivism and compliance measure for those 2 behaviors. And we measure pro-social motivation and perceived norm. And then their the trust in government, both in terms of their efficacy and benevolence. Okay. And we did find that collectivism possibly predicted people's willingness to sign on for DCT. And that it also showed the positive relationship between collectivism and face covering. wearing masks. So that's not that surprising. But when you look at when we did analysis for our primary purpose of research, what we have found was that collectivism indeed predicted all three things, meaning the collectivistic individuals tend to be more pro-social, and they also perceive stronger norm and cohesion within their group, and also they have a stronger trust in government. However, it turned out that the only perceived norm and trust in government actually played a role as a mediator. Okay, and then the same pattern we found with the face covering. So basically, wrap up. Given that, sorry for I have to go so fast. So just to wrap up, what we found in these two studies is that collectivism is associated with the confidence in efficacy of one's group in response to a contagious disease threat. And then it seems like this confidence is based on collectivist individual perception of their group being cohesive. You know, we are in it together. I trust other people do the right thing, and therefore I'll do the right thing kind of idea, as well as they trust in their leadership and government, it seems. And basically this leads to a greater willingness to comply with the public messages, you know, and then health recommendations and whatnot. And just a quick implication, you know, coping with the societal threat, you could, you know, I think as Ron mentioned about something like climate change, I think this can apply something other than just disease threat, coping with larger level threat, you know, and, you know, it is worthwhile to look at how culture and cultural value plays a role in there, you know, what is the best lever to move people essentially. And then, you know, I think it is interesting to know that the aspect of collectivism and what seem to be helping people to increase social coordination and cohesion. It doesn't seem like it is so much a pro-sociality per se, but it is more like, you know, the group wants to do something. What can I do to empower the group seems to be what is driving this positive outcome. And I think that is something that's relevant even in not so individualistic, not so collectivistic environment. And with a really rushed end of it, just a last quote, you know, you can read it. COVID has also reminded us that for all our differences, we are one human race and we are stronger together. And I think collectivistic way of thinking about things might be a key to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. You've covered quite a lot of material, a lot of studies, and I think that's appropriate. You know, these are very complicated questions. One of the fascinating and very sad things is COVID has been common around the world, although a lot of variations. And so the opportunities to actually compare across context, sites, countries, all sorts of things to a crisis that is pretty devastating. This is very, very rare, very unfortunate. It's a naturally occurring and devastating field experiment. So for instance, you can compare across countries on something that we all say, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. That's very, very rare. And so that also then requires the methods that you're using of you know, multi-level modeling. And some other studies are going to do that as well. So this actually corresponds a bit to Claude's work and later also Haijing's and also later Moose's, where you're looking at underlying values. So we can say collectivism, individualism is in that sense an underlying value too. So all these are very fascinating, very sophisticated, very thoughtful, lots of work. Thank you so much. Okay, we're now going to turn to Haijing Ma, who is a colleague of Claude Miller's, and I believe that you just successfully defended your dissertation. Is that not correct?
Yes.
All right, so in order to reward her, we're making her present her research.
Thank you.
And non-academics would not think that that was a reward. Her research interests are health communication and social influence. She's interested in the emotional cognitive processing of messages, dealing with health relevant issues and risks, e.g. COVID-19, vaccination, obesity, tornadoes, climate change, etc. So she's a very positive and happy person dealing with things that are not always very positive. Please take us away. Oh.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So thank you, Dr. Rice, first for the invitation. It's such a great honor for me to present on this conference. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ma. I just defended my dissertation a couple days ago. Now it's official. I'm a doctor. Yeah. So I study social influence and health communication. Most of my work is about designing messages to promote health behavior change. So here comes to this presentation. It is part of a project by advisor Dr. Claude Miller and I worked on and published during the pandemic last year. So in this project, we looked at how blaming the virus or humans for the pandemic influences people's responses to the message, promoting protective behaviors to reduce the infection. So the question is, who should we blame, the virus or humans for the pandemic? So here, let's start from the beginning of the story. Agency assignment. So for any given event, we can attribute causes or responsibility to one or more agents, while calling out everything else passive. And assigning responsibility to a particular agent or more agents means we attribute a positive and active role to it. So in this study, we looked at the risk perceptions associated with human agency or threat agency assignment. When a message is framed in terms of threat agency assignment, the threat being responsible for the negative consequences puts humans at a passive position. So the threat is an active agent. It conveys the impression that the circumstances is less controllable, and it conveys the impression that the threat is really risky. So for example, we can say the virus has infected millions of people. So in this case, the virus is the active agent, whereas the humans are passive. Humans are infected. They're not want to be infected, they're passive, but the virus is the one we should blame. In contrast, if a message is framed in terms of human agency assignment, the humans are active agents. The threat then becomes passive. So the threat is subjected to humans' control. It suggests the situation is more manageable, and it conveys the impression that the overall situation is less risky. So for example, we can say millions of people have contracted the virus. Now humans are responsible for what they do. Humans are the active agent. Well, the threat is kind of innocent. So some studies have found when we assign the agent to a threat, people felt higher risk perceptions. For example, Dr. McGlone and his colleagues found people report higher threat perceptions when they assigned the threat to H1N1 virus than humans. In an earlier study, we found people reported higher threat perceptions toward tornadoes when we assigned the agent to tornadoes than humans. So based on these previous findings, we proposed relative to human agency, virus agency assignment will induce higher threat perceptions of the virus. So these studies focused on the threat perceptions associated with threat and human agency assignment. One aspect that is untouched but is always being touched in persuasion is reactance. So let's talk about reactance first. So psychological reactance theory says people believe they have freedom to make their own choices. They have the freedom to have their own beliefs, their attitudes, and engage in specific behaviors. So when their freedoms are threatened, they are motivation aroused to become reactant, to re-establish their freedom. Accordingly, they will get angry. They will have negative thoughts about influence. They will derogate the source of the influence, and they may come to argue against the source of the influence. So you may wonder, how does agency assignment relates to reactance, right? So let's look at what we found. So in the tornado study I just mentioned, we found people reported lower threat perception towards the message assigning the agent to tornadoes than the message assigning the agent to humans. So thinking back, it makes sense to us because tornado destruction may be perceived as an act of God, or tornado is a natural disaster that humans have no control whatsoever. So the message assigning the agent to humans, blaming humans for what they are suffering during the tornado does not make that much sense. So they will feel that their freedoms are threatened. However, the pandemic's destruction may be perceived as the act of humans. And it's clear to many people that humans have a considerable level of control over the transmission of the pandemic. So people should agree more with a message framed in terms of human agency assignment that is consistent with their belief about attribution of the responsibility and that maintains their freedom. So we proposed, relative to human agency assignment, the virus agency assignment will lead to more freedom through perceptions and more reactance, reflected by anger and negative cognitions. So as I said before, reactance usually leads to defensive responses, such as source derogation and counter-argue. Therefore, we propose the following two hypotheses. Relative to human agency assignment, the virus agency assignment will lead to more source derogation and also more counter-arguing. So to test our hypothesis, we collect data on Amazon and Target. It is an online platform for data collection. We recruited 207 participants and we randomly assigned them into either human threat agency assignment or human agency assignment condition. In either condition, they read a message. That message was created just for that condition. And after the message, they filled out a battle of skills measuring their perceptions of the threat of the virus. And we measured their perceptions of the freedom threat. Their anger, negative thoughts, which reflects reactance, and also source derogation and counter-arguing. So let's look at the message we showed them. So for example, the threat agency message, we told people that COVID-19 kills people. It may get you, it may prey on you, it may catch you, it may be chasing you, and you may be his victim. So in this case, the virus is the active agent and is responsible for the consequences. Whereas in human agency message, we said people die from the virus, people may contract the virus, people may catch the virus. It's people themselves that opening the door for the virus. So what happened to humans is because of what they do. So it's people's responsibility, their own responsibility for the negative consequences. So let's see what we found. We found people reported higher freedom threat perceptions in the threat agency assignment than human agency assignment. Okay, so you can look at the line, the scores. This one. For anger, we found the same pattern. People reported more anger in the virus agency condition than human agency condition. So did the negative cognitions. People reported more negative thoughts toward the message in the threat agency condition than the human agency condition. Same for counter-arguing. People counter-argued more in the threat agency condition than human agency condition. For source credibility, it reflects source derogation. So high source credibility means lower source derogation. So in this case, we found people report a lower source credibility for threat agency condition than human agency condition. It means people derogated more in the threat agency condition than the human agency condition. So these findings quite consistent with each other. What this told us is that in the current case, using virus agency message may generate reactance. People feel their freedoms are threatened, they are angry, they have a lot of negative thoughts about the message, they counter-argue against the message, and they derogate the source of the message. So people are less receptive of the message. But human agency generates less reactance, so people are more receptive to the message. However, we did not find a significant difference between these two message conditions in terms of people's intentions to take protective behaviors. We think that is because people were exposed to one single message in the study, and also the message exposure is quite short, like 30 seconds. So because people are more receptive of human agency messages, so we think with multiple messages, human agency assignment should be more accepted than virus agency assigned message. Generalizing the finding to other future studies, we are thinking we should take target populations' beliefs into account when we are considering using virus agency or human agency. If people's beliefs about the attribution of responsibilities are consistent with what the agency suggests, they may be more accepting of the message. If it is not inconsistent, the use of that agency assignment may backfire. Okay. And thank you for your listening.
Wow, thank you so much. That's a good example of taking a very complex issue and thinking about it very, very clearly, laying out the pieces, and then presenting very, very clear results.
Thank you.
Well, once again, all the things that we're talking about here are very complex and very sophisticated and very subtle. And it's easy for people to say, oh, it's because of this, because of that. We understand that things are more complex. So then the challenge is, how do you present them in ways that are clear? So this is a great classic study in terms of persuasion, message design, health campaigns. Really very, very thoughtful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
And we actually have plenty of time. She was very kind to move ahead very quickly because we'd fallen behind just a little bit, but we do have some time. So I'm going to turn it over to Gavin, and if he does not have any questions, then we may ask questions, and that's fine too. We can just ask them verbally because we participants can't actually post a question, only audience members. So those in the audience, please post some questions for us.
Yeah, I mean, while we wait for the audience to submit questions, there's one question that came to mind that I think could be relevant for all the panelists is that, kind of depending on what news reporting you're reading, it seems like there's much debate on whether or not the United States will be able to reach herd immunity for COVID-19. But my question is, if we are not able to reach herd immunity in the United States, what's one tip that you have for public health message campaign managers that would really help us moving forward?
Is that for all three or anyone?
Yeah, just anyone, all three.
No one's off the hook.
Well, I could say that I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think that we're not going to get to herd immunity. And I don't actually, it's a matter of how long it takes to get there. Whether we get there from being vaccinated or from catching the disease ourselves and developing immunity that way. So I think eventually everybody's going to be, not everybody, but we'll all be protected by herd immunity. How could we speed that up? I think we could make more effective, as a message designer and a social influence scholar, make more effective messages that appeal to the way people, respond at the gut level, and not necessarily at the intellectual level, but intuitively. I have a question for Dr. Kim, if I may.
Yes.
So
Yes.
It seemed like Heijing, you can have a response to that question.
I thought I was gonna dodge it.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, it's okay. No. Why don't you give your answer to that question and then also let Claude have at you as well.
Okay. It's a difficult question, and I agree with Claude that I hope that's not the case. I mean, at some point, I guess as a society, we need to make decision like cost-benefit analysis. Like certain things, I think we can go on doing for a long time. Like a mask wearing isn't really that costly, whereas shutting down everything is costly. It's not a really sustainable way of coping with it. So we'll have to make a little different calculation about what is worth it, what isn't in a bit. But I'm not a biologist, but the reason why COVID-19 is particularly devastating is because it's novel. At some point, it probably will become less biologically novel, and eventually we will reach the position that it's not such a like drastic threat, to the same magnitude. So, but yeah, some things will go on, and I think what is important is though there's certain things that behaviors that is protective, that are some of them should continue, but certain psychological unnecessary negative harmful response like a xenophobic tendency or committing like hate crime, and obviously those type of things should be try to be we should all try to minimize as much as we can.
Okay, Claude, now you had a question for her.
Yeah, it fits right in with what you just now said. In the US here, we're pretty much an individualistic culture. And so we have a lot of polarization, and that's a problem, especially for people on the right refusing to wear masks or social distance. Or do you think that collectivism, people in collectivist cultures show less of this ideological polarization?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, my other line of research kind of focusing more on climate change and stuff like that. We have ample data suggesting that personal own thinking or belief or ideology is not a strong predictor of their behavior in more collectivistic society. For them, kind of like more like responding to social norm and expectation is a bigger predictor. Whereas, something like, like if you believe in climate change in the place like United States or other individualistic society, that pretty much directly translate to whether they support pro-environmental action or not. You don't find the same relationship in more collectivistic societies.
Of course, the interesting thing there is that we're presuming a collective society always has the collective benefit, right? So you could have a collectivist society that actually promotes a harmful norm, and people would follow that too.
Yeah,
So
that too. Yeah.
yeah, we can't presume that
Oh, yes,
necessarily a positive.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that collectivism is good for everything. I mean, there are times, I think I always have sort of theoretical position that I think individualism is, in a way, I mean, this is just completely my, conjecture, but individualism tend to be better, perhaps, orientation when things are less threatening. Whereas when there's a lot of large threat, that's when collectivists tend to become, more responsive, and they are better at kind of get their group together to move. In some ways, I think there's a theory such as including pathogen prevalence theory that argue that essentially collectivism is, is a cultural coping mechanism, in the face of large threat. So, yeah.
Cool. Kevin, back to you. Do you have anything else? Oh, we did hear from Haijing's response to his initial question. Do you have can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So, if let's imagine that the United States is not able to reach herd immunity, and there's a lot of data saying that actually might be the case, depending on how many variants propagate, whether or not we can get anti-vaxxers or people who are just not willing to take the vaccine to actually get vaccinated. There's a high likelihood that this could be a part of just our normal lives moving forward. So what would your research, if you could use your research to communicate one thing to people who are managing public health campaigns, what's the tip that you would give them for how to design their messages?
I think it would be good to use social media data. Like, because how to say, because we rely a lot on our social media use during this time. If we cannot return to the normal life, maybe wearing a mask becomes a new normality. So we can resort to how people connect, like let's say share social media posts or blogs, and then see generally how people respond to, like, let's say mask related topic or mask related issues, and using what we found from their social media related data and design the message.
Great. And actually, in our next session, we will have just exactly some of that research from Musa and Renee and the Media Neuroscience Lab. All right, well, let's take a break for about 14 minutes. We'll come back to our next session. I want to thank all of you. We just all enjoy this. We're learning from each other. It's complex. There's so many different ways of looking at this. It's a really rich topic. We could have an entire course just with this group. Actually, we have an entire master's degree, PhD. We have an entire school just based on these people.